Welcome to Phrase by Phrase, where we are studying the Bible one phrase at a time. And today we are in James chapter 1, verse 15b. We're looking at the nature of temptation, and today we're examining the consequential nature of temptation. And verse 15 says, "Then when lust has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and when sin is accomplished, it brings forth death." That's the consequence. It brings forth death. It always leads to death. And for the unsaved, this is ultimately true in that they are separated from God for eternity. But James is writing here to believers. And he's saying that, for the Christian, there is a type of death that takes place when sin is committed. Death means the severing from environment. Like you take a letter out of an envelope and you separate that letter from the environment of the envelope. So death is always a separating. When we die physically, the spirit is separated from the environment of the physical body. There's a separating in that sense. Well, the culprit that leads us to sin is our own lust. So when we sin, we are separated, if you will, from the influence of the spirit. Galatians 5:17 says, "For the flesh sets its desire against the spirit, and the spirit against the flesh. For these are in opposition to one another, so that you may not do the things that you please." There's a severing, a joining of ourselves to the nature of lust within, and a separating of self from the influence of the spirit, and that leads to destruction in a person's life, a form of death. In Romans 8:13 we read, "For if you are living according to the flesh, you must die." The reason sin leads to destruction in the believer is because we become like the one we obey. So Romans 6:16 says, "Do you not know that when you present yourselves to someone as slaves for obedience, you are slaves of the one whom you obey?" We become conformed to our lust instead of the image of Christ when we give in to sin. And that's dangerous because lust is a monster that can never be satisfied. Jim Moss described it this way. He said, "Lust is craving for salt by a man who is dying of thirst." The destructive nature of lust can be seen by the recounting of an anonymous author telling his story in Leadership magazine. He was addicted to pornography, and he describes his lust like this. He said, "I learned quickly that lust points only in one direction. You cannot go back to a lower level and stay satisfied. Always you want more. A magazine excites. A movie thrills. A live show makes the blood run. I never got as far as outright prostitution, but I've experienced enough of the unquenchable nature of sex to frighten me for good. Lust does not satisfy, it stirs up. I no longer wonder how deviants can get into child molesting, masochism, and other abnormalities. Although such acts are incomprehensible to me, I remember well that where I ended up was also incomprehensible to me when I started." Lust keeps driving us toward a place where we are dead to life. We can't enjoy true pleasure without perverting it. We're never satisfied. We forfeit the purpose for which we were created. Ron Meredith, in his book, Hurrying Big for Little Reasons, describes one quiet night in early spring. And this is what he says: "Suddenly out of the night came the sound of wild geese flying. I ran to the house and breathlessly announced the excitement I felt. What is to compare with the wild geese across the moon? It might have ended there except for the sight of our tame mallards on the pond. They heard the wild call they had once known. The honking out of the night sent little arrows of prompting deep into their wild yesterdays. Their wings fluttered a feeble response. The urge to fly, to take their place in the sky for which God made them, was sounding in their feathered breasts, but they never raised from the water. The matter had been settled long ago. The corn of the barnyard was too tempting. Now their desire to fly only made them uncomfortable. Temptation is always enjoyed at the price of losing the capacity for flight." And that's perhaps the worst consequence of all, that temptation is always enjoyed at the price of losing the capacity for flight. A person loses the ability to be intimate with God because spiritual intimacy is founded on love, which requires selfless giving. And while lust produces a selfish hoarding that pulls everything in on itself like a black hole. And in that state, there can be no intimacy. We have lost the capacity for flight. So how do we beat temptation? We've been looking at the nature of temptation. Now, how do we beat it? That's what we'll look at next time when we study the Bible phrase by phrase.